Chapter 1. A Letter with Lavender Edges. The letter arrived on a mild morning in early May of 1955, when the hedges of St. Mary Mead were trimmed into obedient lines, and the roses, though not yet in full bloom, promised a generous season ahead. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting resting lightly in her lap, turned the envelope over before opening it. She noticed first the paper, thick, faintly scented with lavender, and then the handwriting which carried a nervous precision. She murmured, adjusting her spectacles. Celia always did try to write as though she were composing a school essay. She broke the seal with careful fingers. The name Celia Wren lingered in her thoughts with a quiet fondness. Goddaughter, though not by blood, but by long acquaintance and the intricate webs of village friendship. Celia had been a bright child once, observant in a way that pleased Miss Marple greatly, though in recent years her letters had grown less frequent, their tone slightly strained. Miss Marple began to read. Dearest Aunt Jane, I do hope you are well. It has been far too long since I last visited St. Mary Mead, though I think of it often. Life here in Harrowby End has been, well, rather complicated of late. I hesitate to trouble you, but I find myself increasingly uneasy. There are things here that do not seem quite right. I cannot explain them clearly in writing, but I should very much value your advice. Would you consider coming to stay for a few days? I feel I should be much easier in my mind if you were here. With affection, Celia Miss Marple read the letter twice more before folding it neatly. Complicated, she said softly. Such a curious word to choose when one means something else entirely. She set aside her knitting and reached for her teacup, now only lukewarm. Outside, a blackbird hopped along the garden path, pecking with industrious determination. There was nothing overtly alarming in Celia's letter, no mention of danger, no clear request for intervention, but Miss Marple had long since learned that the absence of detail often spoke more loudly than its presence. She recalled Celia as a child, quick to notice when a biscuit tin had been tampered with, or when someone's tone concealed irritation beneath politeness. A girl who had understood even then that people rarely said exactly what they meant. If such a person now wrote of unease without explanation, it suggested something worth attending to. Miss Marple rose slowly, her joints protesting in familiar fashion, and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner. She selected a sheet of paper and began her reply at once. By the following afternoon, arrangements had been made. The journey to Harrowby End required 2 trains and a short motorcar ride through gently rolling countryside that bore little resemblance to St. Mary Mead. Where her own village nestled comfortably within its habits, Harrowby End seemed more exposed, its houses spaced farther apart, its lanes less inclined to invite idle wandering. Miss Marple observed all of this with quiet interest, as the hired car conveyed her towards Celia's residence. Not a place where one naturally encounters one's neighbours, she remarked. The driver, a man of few words, nodded without elaboration. The house itself, Wren House, Stjert, as it was called, stood somewhat apart from the rest of the village. It was larger than Miss Marple had expected, a pale stone structure with tall windows and an air that suggested both respectability and a certain degree of isolation. Celia was waiting at the door. "My dear Aunt Jane," she exclaimed, hurrying forward with a brightness that did not entirely conceal her tension. "I was afraid your journey might be tiresome." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied gently, allowing herself to be led inside. "One always sees something interesting when travelling, provided one keeps one's eyes open." Celia smiled, though it flickered. "You must be exhausted. I'll have tea brought in at once." The interior of the house was tastefully arranged, though Miss Marple noted a curious absence of personal clutter. It had the appearance of a place carefully maintained, yet not entirely lived in. They settled in a sitting room overlooking a narrow stretch of garden. "You look well," Miss Marple said, studying Celia with quiet attention. "Do I?" Celia replied lightly. "I'm glad to hear it." There was a pause. Miss Marple did not press her immediately. Instead, she spoke of St. Mary Mead, the vicar's recent sermon, the troublesome habits of a certain Mrs. Price Ridley, and the unfortunate tendency of younger residents to misunderstand perfectly simple matters. Celia listened, her posture gradually easing, though her fingers remained tightly clasped in her lap. It was only when the tea had been poured, and the first cup nearly finished, that Miss Marple spoke again, her tone unchanged. You wrote that things here felt complicated. Celia's gaze shifted briefly toward the window. Yes, she said at last. I suppose that is a rather vague way of putting it. Vagueness is often quite intentional, Miss Marple observed. It allows one to speak without fully committing to what one knows. Celia let out a small, humorless laugh. You see straight through me, as always. I see only what is placed before me, Miss Marple replied, though sometimes it is arranged in such a way that certain conclusions suggest themselves. Celia rose abruptly and moved toward the mantelpiece, where several framed photographs stood. There are people here, she began, who are not what they seem. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that they are exactly what they seem, but that what they seem is not what one first believes. Miss Marple watched her with mild interest. That sounds rather like a puzzle. It feels like one, Celia said, and I cannot tell whether I am imagining things or whether something truly is wrong. She picked up one of the photographs and handed it to Miss Marple. This is everyone, she explained, at least everyone who matters. Miss Marple examined the image carefully. There were 5 figures gathered on a lawn. Celia herself, standing slightly apart. A tall man with a composed expression, a woman whose smile appeared carefully constructed, and 2 others, one younger, one older, each displaying a distinct manner of watchfulness. Who are they? Miss Marple asked. Celia hesitated. That is Mr. Ah, Adrian Cross, she said, indicating the tall man. He manages the estate next door and has been very helpful since my aunt passed away. And the others? Mrs. Beatrice Cross, his wife. Then there is Dr. Lionel Firth, who lives in the village, and Mr. Oliver Dane. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. You speak his name with less certainty. Celia's expression tightened. He arrived only recently. A friend of Mr. Cross, apparently. Apparently, Miss Marple repeated softly. Celia turned away. It's difficult to explain. They are all perfectly polite. Nothing overtly unpleasant. And yet, Miss Marple prompted. Celia drew a breath. And yet I feel as though I am being watched. Not in any obvious way, but in the sense that every word I say is being weighed. Miss Marple set the photograph aside. That is rarely an unfounded impression, she said. People often believe they are subtle when in fact they are merely restrained. Celia looked at her sharply. You think there is something wrong? I think, Miss Marple replied, that you would not have written to me otherwise. A silence followed, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. At length Celia spoke again, her voice lower now. There was an incident last week. Miss Marple's attention sharpened, though her expression did not change. What sort of incident? A small one, perhaps, easily dismissed. Celia paused. But I cannot dismiss it. Miss Marple waited. I found one of my letters opened, Celia said. Not torn or damaged, simply opened and resealed. Which letter? The one I sent to you. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Ah. Celia met her gaze. You see why I wanted you here? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Yes, she said. I believe I do. Outside, the blackbird's distant song carried faintly on the breeze, cheerful and entirely unconcerned. Inside Wren House, however, something had shifted, though not yet in a way that could be clearly defined. Miss Marple reached once more for her teacup, her movements as unhurried as ever. But her eyes, behind the gentle glint of her spectacles, had grown decidedly more attentive. The game, though not yet named, had begun. Chapter 2. The Arrangement of Faces. Morning in Harrowby End arrived with a pale, deliberate light that seemed to take its time settling over the fields. Miss Marple, who had always believed that early hours revealed far more about a household than any formal introduction, was already awake before the clock struck 7. She stood by the window of her guest room observing. The garden below bore signs of careful maintenance, though not of affection. The gravel path had been recently raked, yet no flowers had been planted along its edges. A bench stood beneath a yew tree, positioned with symmetry rather than comfort in mind. A house arranged to be seen, Miss Marple murmured, but not necessarily enjoyed. She dressed with her usual precision and made her way downstairs, pausing briefly in the corridor as she heard voices, low, indistinct and quickly silenced. By the time she entered the dining room, Celia was already seated, though she appeared not to have touched her breakfast. "My dear Aunt Jane," she said, rising at once, "I hope you slept well." "Perfectly," Miss Marple replied. though I confess I woke rather early. One always does in unfamiliar surroundings. Celia managed a small smile. Yes, I imagine so. Before further conversation could follow, the door opened and a man entered with an easy confidence that suggested both familiarity and ownership. "Ah, our guest," he said pleasantly. "Miss Marple, I presume?" Celia turned slightly. "This is Mr. Adrian Cross," she said. "He has been overseeing matters here since my aunt's passing." Mr. Adrian Cross inclined his head with a courteous grace. He was a tall man, well dressed without ostentation, and possessed of a voice that carried warmth without quite reaching sincerity. "A pleasure," he said. "Celia has spoken of you." "How kind," Miss Marple replied, "though I hope not too extensively." "On the contrary," he said lightly. "She has described you as most perceptive." Miss Marple smiled. "One does what one can." There was a brief pause, a pause that Miss Marple noted with interest. It was not awkward, precisely, but it lingered a fraction longer than natural ease would allow. "Will you be staying long?" Mr. Cross asked. "That depends entirely on whether I am wanted," Miss Marple said. "Of course you are wanted," Celia interjected quickly. Mr. Cross's gaze flickered toward her, then back to Miss Marple. "Well," he said, "we shall endeavour to make your stay agreeable." Breakfast proceeded with polite conversation, though Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Cross asked many questions while offering very little of himself in return. A man accustomed to gathering information, she thought, and to giving only what is necessary. It was not long before another presence made itself known. Mrs. Beatrice Cross entered with a composed elegance that bordered on theatrical. She was dressed impeccably for the hour, her hair arranged with care, her expression one of practised cordiality. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, extending a hand, "how very delightful to have you with us." Her voice was smooth, each word placed with intention. Miss Marple took her hand briefly. "You are most kind." Mrs. Cross took her seat and began to pour herself tea. "I do hope you find Harrowby End to your liking," she said, "though I fear it may seem rather quiet after St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Quiet places often contain a great deal," she said. "One simply has to listen." Mrs. Cross's smile held, though something in her eyes sharpened. "Ah, how very true." The door opened once more and a younger man entered, his manner brisk, his expression faintly distracted. "Ah, Dr. Firth," Mr. Cross said. "You're just in time." Dr. Lionel Firth acknowledged the room with a brief nod. "Good morning," he said. "Miss Marple?" Celia supplied. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested the name held little immediate significance for him. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. There was something in his manner, a tension perhaps, or a habit of restraint, that suggested a man carrying more than his profession required. Doctors, she reflected, often saw far more than they chose to acknowledge. "Have you come from the village?" Mrs. Cross asked. "Yes," he replied shortly. "There was a patient I needed to see. And all is well, I trust." Dr. Firth hesitated, just briefly. "As well as can be expected." Miss Marple noticed Celia glance at him, her expression tightening ever so slightly. Before any further inquiry could be made, the final member of the household appeared. Mr. Oliver Dane entered without announcement, his presence quiet yet immediately noticeable. He was neither particularly tall nor especially well dressed, but there was a stillness about him that drew attention. "Good morning," he said. His voice was soft, though it carried clearly. "Mr. Dane," Mrs. Cross said, "you're late." "Am I?" he replied mildly, taking a seat. His eyes moved briefly across the room, pausing for the smallest fraction of a second on Miss Marple before continuing. A man who observes before he speaks, Miss Marple thought, and perhaps prefers not to speak at all. Conversation resumed, though it lacked cohesion. Each person contributed just enough to maintain appearances, yet no one seemed inclined toward genuine exchange. Miss Marple ate sparingly, her attention fixed less on the food than on the subtle interplay unfolding before her. Celia spoke little. Mr. Cross guided the conversation. Mrs. Cross embellished it. Dr. Firth avoided it, and Mr. Dane measured it. Yes, Miss Marple thought, a most interesting arrangement. Later that morning, Celia led Miss Marple into the garden. "I thought you might like some air," she said. "It's quieter out here." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, though one must remember that quietness is not always the same as peace. Celia gave a faint, distracted nod. "You've already noticed them, haven't you?" she said. "Noticed?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "The way they behave," Celia said. "The way they look at one another. It's as though everyone is aware of something, but no one will say what it is." Miss Marple considered this. "That is often the case," she said, "particularly when there is something to be concealed." Celia stopped walking. "You think they are hiding something?" "My dear," Miss Marple said, "everyone is always hiding something. The question is whether it matters." Celia looked down at her hands. "I cannot decide whether I am being foolish," she admitted, "or whether I am in danger." Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained calm. "Those two possibilities are not mutually exclusive," she said. "But fear, when it persists, is rarely without cause." Celia drew a breath. "There is something else," she said. "Something I have not told anyone." Miss Marple waited. "My aunt, before she died, was very particular about her affairs," Celia continued. "She kept records of everything. Letters, accounts, correspondence, all of it." "Yes?" "Some of those papers are missing." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Missing in what sense?" "They are gone," Celia said. "Not misplaced. Gone." "And you discovered this when?" 2 days ago." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And have you mentioned this to anyone?" "No," Celia said quickly. "I didn't dare." "A wise decision," Miss Marple said. Celia looked at her anxiously. "You don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that someone in this house has taken an interest in your aunt's affairs, and that such an interest is unlikely to be accidental." Celia's face paled slightly. "Then you believe—" "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "Solkas, that your unease is entirely justified." They stood in silence for a moment. A breeze stirred the leaves of the yew tree, casting shifting shadows across the path. "I am so glad you came," Celia said at last. Miss Marple gave a small, reassuring smile. "My dear child," she said, "I have the distinct impression that I arrived just in time." From the far end of the garden, unseen by either of them, a figure paused briefly before turning away, and though nothing had yet occurred, nothing that could be named or proven, the careful balance within Wren House had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tilt. Chapter 3. A Conversation by the Yew Tree. Miss Marple had always found that people revealed themselves most readily when they believed they were unobserved. It was not that they acted differently, precisely, but rather that the effort of appearing natural often produced something far more telling. That afternoon she took her knitting into the garden and settled herself upon the bench beneath the yew tree. The position was well chosen. From there she could see the side entrance to the house, the narrow gravel path leading toward the gate, and a portion of the windows overlooking the sitting room. It was a vantage point that suggested idleness, while offering considerable advantage. She began to knit. The soft click of her needles blended pleasantly with the distant hum of bees among the hedges. For a time, nothing disturbed the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. Then the side door opened. Dr. Lionel Firth stepped out, closing it behind him with more care than was strictly necessary. He paused, glancing briefly toward the house before moving down the path. Miss Marple did not look up immediately. "Such a lovely day," she remarked after a moment, as though noticing him only then. Dr. Firth stopped, clearly startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." "That is often the case with gardens," she said mildly. "One forgets how much they contain." He gave a short, uncertain laugh. "Yes, quite." There was a pause, during which Dr. Firth seemed to consider whether to continue on his way or remain. At last, politeness prevailed. "I trust you are settling in comfortably," he said. "Very much so," Miss Marple replied, "though one cannot help but notice that this house has a rather attentive atmosphere." Dr. Firth's expression shifted, just slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." "No?" Miss Marple said. "Perhaps it is only my imagination. At my age, one is prone to such things." "I doubt that," he said quickly. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "You are kind." She resumed her knitting, giving him time. It worked. "You must understand," Dr. Firth said after a moment, "that this is not a typical household." "Few households are," Miss Marple observed, "though each believes itself to be so." He hesitated. "There have been adjustments," he said, "since Miss Wren's aunt passed away." "Adjustments often bring out interesting qualities in people," Miss Marple said. Dr. Firth looked at her more closely now, as though reassessing. "You have a way of putting things," he said. "So I have been told." Another pause followed. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that you have already formed some impressions." "One or two," Miss Marple admitted, "though I prefer to wait before deciding whether they are correct." Dr. Firth nodded, though his gaze had grown distant. "Yes," he said. "That is wise." Miss Marple lowered her knitting slightly. "You seem troubled," she said gently. He stiffened. "Do I?" "Only a little," she replied. "But then, I have always found that doctors carry their concerns rather heavily. It is part of their profession." Dr. Firth exhaled softly. "There are times," he said, "when one wishes not to see quite so much." "Ah," Miss Marple said, "but one cannot help it, can one?" "No," he said quietly, "one cannot." Miss Marple resumed her knitting once more. "Tell me," she said after a moment, "did you know Miss Wren's aunt well?" Dr. Firth's expression tightened. "I attended her during her final illness," he said. "And how did you find her?" He hesitated. "She was precise," he said at last. "Very particular about her affairs." "So I have heard?" "There was nothing remarkable about her passing," he added quickly, "if that is what you are wondering." Miss Marple did not look up. "My dear doctor," she said, "I was wondering nothing of the sort." He shifted slightly. "Of course." The conversation might have ended there, but Miss Marple spoke again, her tone as mild as ever. "It is curious," she said, "how often the ordinary becomes significant only in retrospect." Dr. Firth's hand tightened at his side. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Am I not clear?" Miss Marple asked. "How unfortunate." He said nothing. Miss Marple glanced up at him briefly. "One hears of so many small occurrences," she continued. "A misplaced letter, a document that cannot be found. And such things are easily dismissed at first." Dr. Firth's gaze sharpened. "Who told you about that?" Miss Marple blinked in apparent surprise. "My dear doctor, I said nothing of any particular instance." He stared at her. For a moment it seemed he might speak further. Then, with a visible effort, he composed himself. "I must return to the village," he said. "There are patients waiting." "Of course," Miss Marple said. He turned to go, then paused. "If you are concerned for Miss Wren," he said, "I would advise caution." "In what sense?" Dr. Firth met her gaze directly. "In every sense," he said. Then he left. Miss Marple watched him go, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "Yes," she murmured, "a most conscientious man, and a most uneasy one." It was some minutes before she noticed that she was no longer alone. Mr. Oliver Dane stood near the edge of the garden, his presence as quiet as before. "You choose your position well," he said. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "One finds that certain places are more comfortable than others," she replied. Mr. Dane stepped closer. "Comfort is an interesting word," he said. "It suggests safety." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked. "I have always thought it suggested habit." He regarded her with faint amusement. "You're not what I expected," he said. "That is fortunate," Miss Marple replied. "Expectations are so often inconvenient." Mr. Dane's eyes lingered on her knitting. "You listen," he said, "more than you speak." "A useful practice," she said. "Sometimes," he agreed, "though it can also be dangerous." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Dangerous for whom?" "For those who are being listened to," he said. "Ah," Miss Marple said, "then I shall try to be considerate." Mr. Dane's smile was brief, though it did not reach his eyes. "You have already begun asking questions," he said. "Have I?" "You spoke with Dr. Firth." "A pleasant conversation," Miss Marple said. "Was it?" he asked. "I found it so." Mr. Dane studied her for a moment. "You should be careful," he said. "My dear sir," Miss Marple replied, "I am always careful." He inclined his head slightly. "I wonder," he said. There was something in his tone, not quite a warning, not quite a challenge, that lingered in the air between them. Miss Marple returned her attention to her knitting. "Tell me, Mr. Dane," she said, "how long have you been acquainted with Mr. Cross?" "Not long," he said. "And yet you are staying here." "Yes." "How convenient." "Convenience is often misunderstood," he said. "In what way?" "It is rarely accidental." Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful nod. "Indeed." There was a silence. Then, without further word, Mr. Dane turned and walked back toward the house. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression thoughtful. "A man who speaks in fragments," she murmured, "which suggests he knows a great deal more than he intends to say." She resumed her knitting, though her movements had slowed. 3 conversations in a single afternoon. 3 people, each cautious in a different way, and beneath it all, something not yet visible but unmistakably present. Miss Marple glanced toward the house. "Yes," she said softly. "There is certainly something wrong here." The needles clicked once more, steady, patient, waiting. Chapter 4. Tea, Porcelain and a Fracture. The invitation to tea came from Mrs. Beatrice Cross, delivered with a brightness that suggested both spontaneity and careful design. "My dear Miss Marple," she had said at luncheon, "we must do something properly welcoming. A small gathering this afternoon. Nothing elaborate, of course." Nothing elaborate, Miss Marple reflected later, often required the most elaborate preparation. By 4 o'clock the sitting room had been arranged with deliberate elegance. A low table bore an assortment of porcelain cups, each of a different delicate pattern, as though chosen to display refinement rather than uniformity. The tea itself was poured from a silver pot polished to a near-mirror sheen. Miss Marple took her seat quietly, her eyes moving from one detail to another. Celia sat nearest the window, her posture composed but not relaxed. Mr. Adrian Cross stood by the mantel, on one hand resting lightly against it, as though he preferred not to commit himself to any fixed position. Dr. Firth occupied a chair slightly apart from the others, his attention divided between the room and his own thoughts. And Mr. Oliver Dane leaned against the far wall, his presence unobtrusive yet unmistakably intentional. Mrs. Cross presided over them all. "It is so rare," she said, handing Miss Marple a cup, "to gather without purpose. One forgets how pleasant it can be." Miss Marple accepted the cup with a gentle nod. "Purpose has a way of finding us," she said, "even when we do not seek it." Mrs. Cross's smile remained in place. "How philosophical." "I have always found," Miss Marple replied, "that the smallest occasions are often the most revealing." "Revealing?" Mr. Cross echoed lightly. "Surely you do not expect revelations over tea?" Miss Marple stirred her cup. "One never knows," she said. There was a brief silence. Celia reached for a biscuit but did not eat it. "I think," she said suddenly, "that we should play something. A game, perhaps." Mrs. Cross looked at her with mild surprise. "A game?" "Yes," Celia said. "Something simple, to pass the time." Mr. Dane's gaze flickered toward her. "What sort of game?" he asked. Celia hesitated. "Something with questions," she said. "Harmless questions." Miss Marple observed her closely. "Ah," she thought, "not harmless at all." Mrs. Cross set down her cup. "Well," she said, "if it amuses you." Mr. Cross gave a small shrug. "I have no objection." Dr. Firth did not respond. "Very well," Celia said. "We shall each ask one question of another person." "Nothing too personal." "That is a matter of interpretation," Mr. Dane murmured. Celia ignored him. "I will begin," she said. She turned to Mr. Cross. "Adrian, why did you come to Harrowby End?" The question, though simply phrased, seemed to alter the atmosphere of the room. Mr. Cross smiled. "My dear Celia, I have told you before, your aunt required assistance with the estate. It seemed only natural." "Natural?" Celia repeated. "Yes," he said. "Entirely so." Miss Marple sipped her tea. A rehearsed answer, she thought. Smooth but not spontaneous. "Your turn," Celia said. Mr. Cross inclined his head. "Very well. Dr. Firth, have you ever regretted a professional decision?" Dr. Firth stiffened. "That is an odd question." "Not at all," Mr. Cross said lightly. "We all make choices." Dr. Firth's gaze darkened. "Yes," he said at last. "I have." "Thank you," Mr. Cross said. There was something in his tone, a satisfaction perhaps, that did not go unnoticed. Dr. Firth leaned back slightly, as though withdrawing from the room. Mrs. Cross spoke next. "Mr. Dane," she said, "what brought you here?" Mr. Dane did not answer immediately. "Curiosity," he said at last. "How vague," she replied. "Not at all," he said. "It is the most precise reason I know." Mrs. Cross studied him for a moment, then turned to Miss Marple. "And you, Miss Marple, what do you think of us?" Miss Marple set down her cup. "I think," she said gently, that you are all very interesting." A faint ripple passed through the room. "Interesting?" Mrs. Cross repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "each in your own way." "And what does that mean?" Mr. Dane asked. Miss Marple smiled. "It means that I should like to know you better." No one spoke for a moment. Then Celia rose abruptly. "I believe that is enough," she said. "It was only meant to be a diversion." "A most enlightening one," Mr. Dane said softly. Mrs. Cross began to gather the cups. "Yes," she said. "Quite enlightening." Miss Marple watched as she lifted the teapot. It was a small thing, almost too small to notice, but Mrs. Cross's hand trembled. Not with weakness, Miss Marple thought. With control. She is holding something in. The gathering dispersed soon after. Dr. Firth left first, offering only a brief farewell. Mr. Cross excused himself with a remark about estate matters. Mrs. Cross remained behind to supervise the clearing of the table, and Mr. Dane lingered for a moment longer than necessary before slipping quietly from the room. Celia stood by the window once more. "I should not have done that," she said. "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied, "it was most instructive." Celia turned. "You saw it, didn't you?" "I saw a great many things," Miss Marple said. "They all answered, but none of them answered truthfully," Celia said. Miss Marple considered this. "Not entirely truthfully," she corrected, "but not entirely falsely either." Celia frowned. "I don't understand." "People rarely lie outright," Miss Marple said. "They prefer to adjust the truth, to shape it into something more convenient." Celia's hands tightened. "Then how can one know what is real?" Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. "One watches," she said, "and one waits." Celia looked at her anxiously. "And if waiting is dangerous?" Miss Marple's gaze moved briefly toward the door. "My dear," she said, "I suspect that we are already past that point." At that very moment a sound echoed faintly from somewhere within the house, a door closing. Or perhaps, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, a drawer. Not unusual in itself, and yet, she rose slowly. "I think," she said, "that I should like to take a little walk indoors." Celia stared at her. "Now?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. There was something in her tone that allowed no argument. They stepped into the corridor together. The house, though unchanged, felt different. Quieter, watchful. Miss Marple moved at an unhurried pace, her eyes noting small details. The position of a chair, the angle of a picture frame, the faintest trace of movement where none should have been. They reached the study door. It stood slightly ajar. Celia's breath caught. "I closed that earlier," she whispered. Miss Marple said nothing. She pushed the door open. Inside, the room appeared orderly. Desk, shelves, papers, and yet Miss Marple crossed the room and stopped. One drawer was not quite aligned with the others. She opened it. Empty. Celia stepped forward. "That's where my aunt kept her correspondence," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "I thought as much." Celia's voice trembled. "They're gone." Miss Marple closed the drawer gently. "No," she said. Celia looked at her in confusion. "No?" Miss Marple turned, her expression calm but certain. "They are not gone," she said. "They have been taken." A silence followed. Then, from somewhere behind them, a floorboard creaked. Miss Marple did not turn at once. Instead, she spoke softly. "We are not alone, my dear." Celia froze. And slowly, very slowly, Miss Marple turned toward the doorway. But whoever had been there was already gone. Only the faintest echo of movement remained. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes," she murmured. "Very interesting indeed." And for the first time since her arrival, the shape of danger began to take a clearer form. Chapter 5. The Sound of Water at Dusk. The unease that followed the discovery in the study did not dissipate with evening. It deepened. By the time dusk settled over Wren House, the air had taken on a curious stillness, as though the landscape itself were listening. Miss Marple, seated once again with her knitting, did not knit. Her hands rested lightly in her lap while her mind arranged the afternoon's impressions with quiet precision. A missing set of papers, a resealed letter, a household composed of individuals who spoke carefully and watched one another even more carefully. Yes, she thought, it is beginning to form a pattern. The door opened and Celia entered. "You are very quiet," Celia said. "I am thinking," Miss Marple replied. Celia moved closer, lowering her voice instinctively. "I feel as though everything has changed," she said. "As though something has begun." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "That is often the case," she said, "though one rarely knows precisely when it begins." Celia hesitated. "I don't feel safe here tonight," she admitted. Miss Marple looked at her, not with alarm, but with careful attention. "Tell me," she said, "have there been any other small occurrences? Anything that seemed trivial at the time?" Celia frowned. She paused. "There was something yesterday evening." "Yes?" "I went down to the lower garden," Celia said, "near the old pond." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained gentle. "And what did you observe?" Celia hesitated, as though unsure whether the memory itself was reliable. "I thought I heard voices," she said, "very faint. I couldn't make out what was being said." "Did you see anyone?" "No," Celia said, "but I had the distinct impression that someone had been there only moments before." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you told no one of this?" "No," Celia said. "It seemed foolish." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, "it was most sensible." Celia exhaled. "You think it matters?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that places of water often attract secrets." Celia looked at her in confusion. "Water?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It has a way of concealing things, sounds, objects, even intentions." Before Celia could respond, there came a knock at the door. It was Mr. Adrian Cross. "My dear ladies," he said, stepping inside, "I trust I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied. "I thought you might care to join us for a short walk," he said. "The evening's quite pleasant." Celia stiffened slightly. "A walk?" she repeated. "Yes," he said. "Down toward the lower grounds. The light is particularly fine at this hour." Miss Marple glanced briefly at Celia, then back at Mr. Cross. "That sounds most agreeable," she said. The path to the lower garden was narrow and uneven, bordered by hedges that grew less orderly the farther one went. Miss Marple walked at a measured pace, allowing the others to arrange themselves naturally. Mr. Cross led the way. Celia remained close to Miss Marple, and some distance behind came Mr. Dane. Dr. Firth and Mrs. Cross had declined the walk. "Too cool for my liking," Mrs. Cross had said. Miss Marple, however, suspected other reasons. The pond lay at the far edge of the property, a still dark surface partially obscured by overhanging branches. "There," Mr. Cross said, gesturing. "Quite charming, is it not?" Miss Marple looked at the water. It was not charming. It was quiet in a way that suggested depth rather than peace. "Yes," she said. "Very still." Celia's hand tightened slightly at her side. "This is where I came yesterday," she said softly. "Is it?" Mr. Cross replied. "I wasn't aware you took an interest in this part of the grounds." "I was curious," Celia said. "Curiosity can be a dangerous habit," Mr. Dane remarked from behind them. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "Only when it is discouraged," she said. Mr. Dane did not reply. For a moment they stood in silence. Then Mr. Cross stepped closer to the water. "I have often thought," he said, "that places like this hold a certain finality." Celia looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "Nothing in particular," he said lightly. "Only that water, when undisturbed, gives one a sense of permanence." Miss Marple's gaze moved from him to the pond. Permanence. Yes, she thought. That is one way of describing it. There was a sudden sound, a faint splash. All three turned. "Did you hear that?" Celia whispered. Mr. Dane stepped forward, peering into the shadows. "Probably nothing," he said. But Miss Marple was already moving. Slowly, carefully, she approached the edge of the pond. The surface had settled once more, reflecting the dimming sky. Yet something just beneath. "Celia," she said quietly, "do not come any closer." Celia froze. "What is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on the water. Then she spoke, very softly. "Mr. Cross," she said, "would you be so kind as to fetch a lantern?" There was a pause. "A lantern?" he repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I believe we shall require more light." Mr. Cross hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he turned. "Of course," he said. "I shall return at once." He walked back toward the house. Miss Marple remained where she was. Mr. Dane stepped closer. "You see something," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "What is it?" She did not look at him. "I think," she said, "that we're about to understand a great deal more than we intended." Celia's voice trembled. "Please, tell me." Miss Marple straightened slowly. "In a moment," she said. They waited. The light continued to fade. The pond grew darker, and then a shape. Faint at first, then unmistakable. Celia gasped. "No!" Miss Marple reached out, steadying her. "Do not look too closely," she said. But it was already too late. The surface of the water shifted just enough to reveal it. A figure, still, silent, submerged just beneath the surface. Celia's voice broke. Who is it?" Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding now, fixed upon the dark water. "I believe," she said quietly, "that your fears have just been confirmed." Behind them, footsteps approached, the returning Mr. Cross with the lantern, and so the light would come, and with it, the truth would begin to surface. Chapter 6. The Face Beneath the Water. By the time Mr. Adrian Cross returned with the lantern, the last trace of daylight had nearly vanished, leaving the pond wrapped in a dim, uncertain gloom. "Here we are," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier ease. Miss Marple took the lantern from him without comment and held it slightly forward, angling the light toward the water. The glow spread across the surface, trembling faintly, until it reached the shape beneath. Celia turned away at once, her hand rising to her mouth. "I can't. Please." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You need not look again, my dear," she said softly. But Miss Marple herself did not look away. The light steadied, the features emerged, and with them, recognition. "Doctor." "Firth," she said quietly. Mr. Cross inhaled sharply. "Good God!" Mr. Dane did not speak. For a moment, no one moved. Then Mr. Cross stepped forward. This must be reported at once," he said. "It could be an accident." "No," Miss Marple said. Her voice was calm, but it carried. Mr. Cross stopped. "No," he repeated. Miss Marple lowered the lantern slightly, her gaze still fixed on the water. "No," she said again. "It is not an accident." Celia looked at her, pale and trembling. "How can you know that?" Miss Marple turned, her expression composed. "Because," she said, "people do not fall into water in such a manner, not without disturbance, not without signs, and yet—" She gestured faintly toward the still surface. "There are none." Mr. Dane's voice came quietly from behind them. "You believe he was placed there?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Mr. Cross's tone sharpened. "That is a very serious conclusion." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "but a necessary one." Celia stepped back slightly. "Then someone here. Someone—" She could not finish. Miss Marple did not attempt to soften it. "Yes," she said gently. "Someone here is responsible." The silence that followed was heavier than any before it. Mr. Cross recovered first. "We must return to the house," he said. "This requires immediate attention. The authorities—" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "That would be appropriate." He hesitated, then added, "No one should speak of this until it is properly handled." Mr. Dane gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "A little late for that," he said. Mr. Cross ignored him. "Come," he said. "Miss Wren. Miss Marple." Celia moved reluctantly, her steps unsteady. Miss Marple followed at her side, the lantern still in her hand. Mr. Dane remained behind for a moment longer, his gaze lingering on the pond. Then he turned and followed. The house felt different upon their return, not merely quieter, but altered, as though something long contained had finally been released. Mrs. Beatrice Cross was waiting in the sitting room. She rose at once. "You were gone longer than expected," she said. "Is everything—" She stopped. Something in their faces had already told her. "What has happened?" she asked. Mr. Cross answered. "There has been an incident." Mrs. Cross's eyes moved from him to Miss Marple, then to Celia. "What sort of incident?" Miss Marple set the lantern down carefully. "A death," she said. Mrs. Cross's composure wavered. Who?" "Dr. Firth." The name seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Cross sat down abruptly. "That is not possible," she said. "He was here this afternoon." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He was." Mr. Cross began to pace. "This must be handled properly," he said. "I shall send for the police at once." "Of course," Miss Marple said. He paused. "You're very certain," he said, "that this was not an accident?" Miss Marple met his gaze. Yes. There was something in her tone that left little room for argument. Mr. Cross inclined his head stiffly. "Very well," he said. He left the room. Mrs. Cross looked at Miss Marple with a new intensity. "You seem remarkably composed," she said. "One must be," Miss Marple replied, "in such situations." Mrs. Cross's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you have already formed an opinion?" "I have formed several," Miss Marple said, "though I prefer not to finalise them too quickly." Mrs. Cross leaned back. "How prudent." Celia spoke then, her voice unsteady. "He was there," she said, "in the water, just beneath the surface." "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "You need not describe it further." Mr. Dane moved toward the window. "Curious," he said. "What is?" Mrs. Cross asked. "That he should be found there," he replied. "Of all places." Miss Marple glanced at him. "Not so curious," she said, "given certain circumstances." Mr. Dane turned slightly. "Which circumstances?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The ones we have yet to discuss." There was a pause. Mrs. Cross spoke again. "You imply that this is connected to something else." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I imply nothing," she said. "I merely observe that events rarely occur in isolation." Celia looked between them. "What does that mean?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "It means," she said, "that what has happened tonight is not the beginning." Celia's breath caught. "Then it's part of something. Something already in motion?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Each second seemed louder than the last. Later that evening, after the initial shock had settled into a strained quiet, Miss Marple found herself alone once more. She returned to the sitting room, where the teacups from earlier had been cleared away, leaving no trace of the afternoon's gathering. Only the arrangement of chairs remained. She looked at them thoughtfully. 5 chairs, 5 people, one now gone, and she moved slowly around the room, her eyes tracing the memory of where each had sat. Mr. Cross, by the mantel, Mrs. Cross, at the table, Dr. Firth, slightly apart, Mr. Dane, near the wall, Celia, by the window. Miss Marple paused. "Yes," she murmured. "Positions matter." She moved to the mantel and examined the surface. Nothing disturbed, nothing out of place, and yet... Her gaze shifted, to the window, then beyond it, toward the darkness outside. The pond lay somewhere beyond that darkness. Still. Silent. But no longer empty. Miss Marple clasped her hands lightly. "A man does not end up in water without reason," she said softly. "And a man like Dr. Firth does not meet such an end without knowing something first." She turned away from the window. Her expression had changed. The gentleness remained, but beneath it something sharper had emerged. "Yes," she said, "he knew something. And now, whoever had silenced him would be watching very carefully." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They always do," she said. Then she reached for her knitting once more. Not because she needed it, but because it allowed her to appear exactly as she wished. Harmless, patient, and entirely underestimated, the most dangerous position of all. Chapter 7. Footsteps in the corridor. The house did not sleep easily that night. Sounds, small and indistinct, seemed to travel farther than they ought. Floorboards settling, a distant door closing, the faint whisper of movement where none should have been. Such noises often belong to old houses, Miss Marple knew. Yet this house did not creak with age. It stirred with awareness. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, her knitting untouched once more. The clock on the bedside table showed 11:30. "People who have something to hide," she murmured softly, "rarely retire early." She extinguished the lamp. Darkness settled, though not completely. The thin wash of moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting pale shapes across the floor. Miss Marple did not lie down. Instead, she waited. It was nearly midnight when she heard it. Footsteps. Not hurried, not careless, measured, deliberate. They passed along the corridor outside her door. Miss Marple rose at once, moving with surprising quietness for one of her years. She opened the door just a fraction. The corridor lay dim and empty, at first glance, but then a shadow at the far end, a door closing, softly. Miss Marple stepped into the hallway. She did not hurry. Haste, she had always believed, drew attention. Instead, she walked slowly toward the end of the corridor, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The door that had closed belonged to the study. Miss Marple paused. "Yes," she said under her breath. "I thought as much." She reached the door and placed her hand lightly upon it. It was not locked. She opened it. The study was dark, though not entirely. A faint glow, perhaps from a small lamp hastily extinguished, lingered in the air. Miss Marple stepped inside. The room appeared as it had earlier. Desk, shelves, drawers. But something was different. She moved closer to the desk. The drawer she had examined before, the one that had been empty, now stood slightly open again. Miss Marple pulled it out. Still empty. "Yes," she murmured. "You came back to check." She closed the drawer carefully. Then she noticed it. A small object on the floor, near the leg of the desk. Miss Marple bent slowly and picked it up. A button, dark, plain, recently torn by the look of it. She turned it over in her fingers. "Carelessness," she said softly, "or haste. Either way, it was useful." There came a sound behind her. Miss Marple did not turn at once. Instead, she spoke. "I wonder," she said, "whether you realized you had dropped this." Silence. Then, "You're remarkably observant." It was Mr. Oliver Dane. Miss Marple turned slowly. "Only in small matters," she said. Mr. Dane stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You should not wander the house at night," he said. "Nor should you," Miss Marple replied. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "For someone who claims to observe only small matters," he said, "you seem to involve yourself in very large ones." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find that large matters are often composed of small ones." Mr. Dane's gaze dropped briefly to her hand. "The button," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It may not mean anything." "On the contrary," she said, "it means that someone was here, recently, and in some haste." Mr. Dane considered this. "And you assumed that someone was me?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Was it not?" He did not answer immediately. "Suppose it was," he said at last. "What would you conclude?" Miss Marple slipped the button into her pocket. "That you are looking for something," she said. "And if I am? Then you are unlikely to be the only one." Mr. Dane's expression shifted, just slightly. "You are quite certain of that?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "People rarely search alone when something of value is involved." Mr. Dane moved further into the room. "You believe the missing papers are important?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that Dr. Firth is dead." Mr. Dane held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "he is." "And that suggests," Miss Marple continued, "that whatever those papers contain is worth killing for." There was a pause. "You speak very calmly of it," he said. "At my age," Miss Marple replied, "one grows accustomed to certain truths." Mr. Dane studied her. "You're not afraid," he said. Miss Marple gave a small, almost amused smile. "My dear Mr. Dane," she said, "fear is rarely helpful. Sometimes it keeps one alive. Sometimes it prevents one from thinking," she said. He inclined his head slightly. "Perhaps." Miss Marple moved toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Dane," she said. "You're leaving?" he asked. "For now," she replied. "And what will you do with your observations?" Miss Marple paused. "I shall keep them," she said, "until they are needed." She opened the door and stepped into the corridor. Mr. Dane did not follow. The following morning arrived with a strained quiet. The police had been summoned. Word had spread, quietly but effectively. Harrowby End, though not a place given to overt excitement, had already begun its transformation into something else. Miss Marple entered the dining room to find the household assembled once more. Mr. Cross stood near the window, speaking in low tones to a uniformed officer. Mrs. Cross sat at the table, her composure intact but her eyes sharper than before. Celia remained pale. And Mr. Dane. He was watching. Miss Marple took her seat. The officer turned. "Miss Marple," he said, "I understand you were present when the body was discovered." "Yes," she replied. I shall need a full account." "Of course," she said. Mr. Cross stepped forward. "We're all most eager to assist," he said. The officer nodded. "I'm Inspector Hale," he said, "and I should like to begin at the beginning." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said, "that is always the best place." But as she spoke, her thoughts were elsewhere. The button rested in her pocket. A small thing, easily overlooked, and yet, in her experience, it was never the obvious evidence that mattered most. It was the thing that did not belong. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly around the room. 5 people had gathered here yesterday. Now there were 4, and one of them, she was quite certain, had not expected Dr. Firth to be found so soon. Yes, she thought, someone had made a mistake, and mistakes were the beginning of truth. Chapter 8. Statements and Silences. Inspector Hale proved to be a man of method rather than imagination. Miss Marple approved of method. Imagination, she had often found, led people into unnecessary complications, while method, when applied patiently, revealed what had been there all along. He stood at the head of the dining room table, notebook in hand, his expression composed but attentive. "I should like each of you," he said, "to describe precisely what occurred yesterday evening. No detail is too small." Miss Marple noted the phrase with quiet satisfaction. No detail is too small. Quite right. Mr. Adrian Cross spoke first. "We took a walk," he said. "Miss Wren, Miss Marple, Mr. Dane, and myself." It was my suggestion." "Yes," Inspector Hale said. "And why that particular direction?" Mr. Cross hesitated, only briefly. "It is a pleasant part of the grounds," he said. "I thought Miss Marple might appreciate it." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Very considerate," she murmured. Inspector Hale made a note. "And you had no prior reason to go to the pond?" "None whatsoever," Mr. Cross said. Miss Marple did not look at him, but she did not need to. Inspector Hale turned to Celia. "Miss Wren?" Celia clasped her hands tightly. "We walked together," she said. "And then we saw it." "Who saw it first?" Celia glanced at Miss Marple. Miss Marple did. Inspector Hale looked at her. "And what drew your attention, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple considered her answer. "The water," she said. "It was too still." Inspector Hale frowned slightly. "Too still?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Even a pond will show some disturbance. A ripple, a reflection altered by movement. But this was undisturbed in a way that suggested something beneath it." Inspector Hale paused, then nodded. "I see." He wrote something down. "Mr. Dane?" Mr. Oliver Dane stepped forward slightly. "There is little to add," he said. "We all saw the same thing." "And before that?" Inspector Hale asked. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Mr. Dane's expression remained neutral. "Everything here is unusual," he said. Inspector Hale looked up. "That is not particularly helpful." "No," Mr. Dane agreed, "but it is accurate." Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. Inspector Hale turned to Mrs. Beatrice Cross. "You were not present," he said. "No," she replied. "I remained in the house." "Can anyone confirm that?" Mrs. Cross's eyes flickered just for a moment. "I was alone," she said. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "I see." Miss Marple observed her closely. A small hesitation, very small, but present. Inspector Hale closed his notebook. "For now," he said, "that will suffice. I shall require further statements later." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more question," he said. The room stilled. "Did Dr. Firth have any enemies?" No one answered immediately. Then Mr. Cross spoke. "Not to my knowledge." Mrs. Cross shook her head. "I cannot imagine why he would." Celia remained silent. Mr. Dane said nothing. Inspector Hale looked at Miss Marple. "And you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "I think," she said, "that it is often difficult to recognize an enemy, until it is too late." Inspector Hale studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "Quite so." And with that, he left the room. The moment the door closed, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Mr. Cross exhaled. "Well," he said, "that was inevitable." Mrs. Cross rose from her chair. "I dislike policemen," she said. "They ask questions without understanding the answers. They understand more than they appear to, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Cross gave her a sharp look. Do they? Yes, Miss Marple replied, though not always the right things. Mr. Dane moved toward the window. An interesting performance, he said. Celia turned to him. Performance, she repeated. Yes, he said. We all played our parts. Celia's face flushed. This is not a game. No, Mr. Dane said. It is not. Miss Marple watched them both. Emotion, she thought, is often the first thing to betray a person. She rose slowly. I believe, she said, that a little fresh air would be beneficial. No one objected. The garden in daylight appeared almost unchanged. The pond, now under police attention, lay cordoned off in the distance. Miss Marple walked along the path, her pace unhurried. Celia followed. I feel as though they are all hiding something, Celia said. Miss Marple nodded. They are, she said. All of them? Yes, Miss Marple replied, though not all in the same way. Celia frowned. I don't understand. Mr. Cross hides intention, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Cross hides emotion. Mr. Dane hides knowledge. And Dr. Firth? Celia asked quietly. Miss Marple's expression softened. He hid fear, she said. Celia's breath caught. Fear of what? Miss Marple looked toward the pond. That, she said, is what we must discover. They walked in silence for a few moments. Then Celia spoke again. You think the papers are connected to this, she said. I'm quite certain of it, Miss Marple replied, but we don't know what they contained. No, Miss Marple said, but we know that someone wanted them. Celia stopped walking. And someone killed for them. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. Celia looked at her, her eyes filled with unease. Then we are all in danger. Miss Marple considered this. Not all, she said. Celia stared at her. What do you mean? Miss Marple turned, her gaze steady. The person who took the papers, she said, is not in danger. A silence followed. Celia's voice trembled. Then one of them is... Yes, Miss Marple said. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. As they turned back toward the house, Miss Marple's mind returned to the previous night. The footsteps, the study, the button. She reached into her pocket and touched it lightly. A small thing. But it did not belong to her, which meant it belonged to someone else, and sooner or later, that someone would reveal themselves. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People are creatures of habit, she said softly. Celia looked at her. What? Miss Marple shook her head. Nothing, my dear, she said, but her thoughts were already moving ahead, toward the next mistake, because there would be one. There always was, and when it came, Miss Marple intended to be ready. Chapter 9. The Weight of an Ordinary Detail. Inspector Hale returned sooner than expected. Miss Marple, who had been seated in the morning room with her knitting, this time genuinely knitting, looked up as he was shown in. His expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough. A development, Inspector? She asked pleasantly. Yes, he said. Several, in fact. Miss Marple set her work aside. Do sit down, she said. You must be quite occupied. He did not sit immediately. I've had the preliminary report, he said. Dr. Firth did not drown. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. No, she said. I did not think he had. Inspector Hale studied her. You're not surprised. I am rarely surprised, Miss Marple replied, though I am often interested. He sat then, placing his notebook on the table. There were marks, he said. Around the throat, not obvious at first, but quite clear upon examination. Miss Marple folded her hands. Yes, she said. That would be consistent. With what? He asked. With someone who did not wish him to speak, she said. Inspector Hale leaned back slightly. You seem very certain of motive. Not certain, Miss Marple corrected, but inclined. He tapped his pencil thoughtfully. And what inclination is that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That Dr. Firth knew something he should not have known, or perhaps knew it at an inconvenient time. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. That aligns with our thinking, he said, but knowing something is not the same as proving it. No, Miss Marple agreed, but it is often the beginning. He regarded her carefully. I understand you are acquainted with Miss Wren, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. She is my goddaughter. And you came here at her request? Yes. Did she indicate any specific concern? Miss Marple paused. Not long, but just enough. She felt uneasy, she said, about the people here. Inspector Hale's gaze sharpened. Which people? Miss Marple gave a small, almost apologetic smile. All of them, she said. He let out a short breath. That is not particularly helpful. On the contrary, Miss Marple said gently, it is quite accurate. Inspector Hale leaned forward slightly. Miss Marple, he said, I should like your candid opinion. Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. About what? About who might have done this. Miss Marple considered him. You ask a great deal, she said. I do, he replied. Because I think you have already formed a view. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she reached for her knitting again, adjusting a stitch that had slipped. It is not yet complete, she said. Inspector Hale frowned. I beg your pardon? My view, Miss Marple said. It is not yet complete. He watched her for a moment. Then what is missing? Miss Marple looked up. A small thing, she said. A very small thing. Inspector Hale's expression did not change, but his attention sharpened. What sort of thing? Miss Marple smiled. The sort that is easily overlooked, she said. After he left, Miss Marple remained where she was. Her knitting lay idle once more. A small thing, she repeated softly. She reached into her pocket and took out the button. It rested in her palm, plain, dark, unremarkable, and yet it did not belong. Now Miss Marple turned it over slowly. Buttons, she murmured, are most obliging objects. They remain exactly where they are placed, until they are not. She rose. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Luncheon was served with a strained formality, each person present but not entirely engaged. Miss Marple took her seat and observed. Mr. Adrian Cross appeared composed, though his movements were slightly more controlled than before. Mrs. Beatrice Cross was impeccably arranged, her expression flawless. Celia spoke very little, and Mr. Oliver Dane... He watched. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to move casually from one to another. Then she saw it. Not the absence, the presence. Mr. Cross's jacket, one button, slightly different from the others, replaced. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, she thought, there you are. She did not react. Instead, she lifted her teacup. Such a pity about Dr. Firth, she said lightly. Celia flinched. Yes, she said. Mr. Cross inclined his head. A tragic occurrence, he said. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, and so sudden. Mrs. Cross set down her fork. Must we discuss it at table, she said. I find, Miss Marple said gently, that conversation often reveals what silence conceals. Mrs. Cross's lips tightened. How philosophical you are. Miss Marple smiled. One learns. Mr. Dane spoke then. You believe this is not over, he said. Miss Marple looked at him. No, she said. I do not. Celia's voice trembled. What do you mean? Miss Marple set down her cup. I mean, she said, that whatever Dr. Firth knew is still here. A silence fell. Mr. Cross spoke carefully. And what makes you think that? Miss Marple met his gaze. Because, she said, it has not yet been used. Mr. Dane's eyes narrowed slightly. Used? He repeated. Yes, Miss Marple said. Information of value is rarely kept without purpose. Mrs. Cross rose abruptly. I have had enough of this, she said. Speculation helps no one. She left the room. Celia looked after her, then back at Miss Marple. You think someone is waiting, she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. For what? Miss Marple's gaze moved once more to Mr. Cross's jacket. For the right moment, she said. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone in the garden. Her thoughts were no longer scattered. They had begun to align. The letter, the missing papers, Dr. Firth's unease, the pond, the button, and now, the replacement. She paused near the yew tree. Yes, she said softly. It is nearly complete. There remained only one question. Not who, but why. Miss Marple turned slowly. Behind her, at a distance, Mr. Adrian Cross stood watching. He did not approach. He did not speak, but his gaze lingered. Miss Marple met it calmly, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not acknowledgement, not accusation, but recognition. He knows that I know something, Miss Marple thought, but not what. She gave him a small, polite smile. He returned it, then turned away. Miss Marple watched him go. "Yes," she murmured. "The smallest details are always the most dangerous." She slipped the button back into her pocket. The pattern was forming, and very soon it would be complete. Chapter 10. A Pattern Beneath Politeness. That evening Wrenhouse attempted, unsuccessfully, to return to normal. Dinner was announced at precisely the usual hour. The table was set with its accustomed care. Candles were lit, their steady glow casting a composed and civilized light over a room that no longer deserved the description. Miss Marple took her place, as though nothing had changed, which she reflected was precisely how such moments must be approached. Mr. Adrian Cross was already seated. His manner was calm, his expression attentive, yet something in his stillness had altered. It was not unease, no, he was too controlled for that, but rather a heightened awareness. A man adjusting his position, Miss Marple thought. Very carefully. Mrs. Beatrice Cross entered shortly after, composed as ever, though her eyes seemed to rest longer than necessary on each person present. Celia followed, pale but determined. And finally, Mr. Oliver Dane. He did not take his seat at once. Instead, he stood briefly at the end of the table as though considering something invisible to the others. Then he sat. Dinner began. Polite conversation resumed, though it moved with effort rather than ease. Miss Marple listened. That, she had always believed, was far more useful than speaking. Mr. Cross directed the conversation toward inconsequential matters. The weather, local arrangements, the inconvenience of police presence. Mrs. Cross contributed where required, her tone smooth, her manner controlled. Celia said very little. And Mr. Dane? He said nothing at all. Miss Marple buttered her bread carefully. Then, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, she spoke. "I have always found," she said, "that the smallest inconsistencies are the most interesting." There was a pause. Mr. Cross looked up. "Inconsistencies?" he repeated. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "They are so easily overlooked." Mrs. Cross set down her fork. "What sort of inconsistencies?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, quite ordinary ones," she said. "A misplaced object, a changed habit, a detail that does not quite match its surroundings." Mr. Dane's gaze shifted toward her. "And you have noticed such things here?" he asked. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. "One or two," she said. Celia looked at her anxiously. "Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple raised a hand lightly. "Nothing of immediate concern," she said. "Merely observations." Mr. Cross leaned back slightly. "And what do these observations suggest?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "That someone has been obliged to act more quickly than they intended," she said. Silence. It lasted longer this time. Mrs. Cross spoke first. "That is a very curious remark," she said. "Is it?" Miss Marple replied. "Yes," Mrs. Cross said, "because it implies—" "What, exactly?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "It implies," she said, "that a plan has been disturbed." Mr. Dane's expression sharpened. "And by whom?" he asked. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "By circumstances," she said. Celia's voice trembled. "You mean Dr. Firth?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "He altered something." Mr. Cross's tone remained even. "And what might that have been?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That," she said, "is what I am considering." Dinner ended soon after. The attempt at normalcy had failed. Each person withdrew, some quickly, others with more care, but all with the same underlying intention. Distance. Miss Marple did not follow them immediately. Instead, she remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes resting on the table. 5 places had once been set. Now there were 4, and yet the arrangement still felt incomplete. "Yes," she murmured. "Something is missing." She rose slowly and made her way to the sitting room. Celia was there, standing by the window. "You're frightening them," she said without turning. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "My dear," she said. They were already frightened. Celia turned. "You know something," she said. "I know several things," Miss Marple replied. "Then why won't you say it?" Celia asked. Miss Marple considered her carefully. "Because," she said, "it is not yet time." Celia's hands tightened. "When will it be time?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. when the truth can no longer be avoided, she said. Celia looked at her helplessly. Oh, and until then? Until then, Miss Marple said gently, we observe. Later that night, Miss Marple returned once more to the study. Not in secrecy this time, in certainty. She stood in the centre of the room, her eyes moving slowly across its contents. Desk, shelves, drawers, order, control. Yes, she said softly. A room for someone who prefers things to remain exactly as they are. She moved to the desk and rested her hand upon it. And yet, she continued, something here has been disturbed. She opened the drawer again. Empty. But that was not what interested her. She closed it. Then she turned to the shelves, books, ledgers, papers. Her gaze lingered. Then she reached out and removed a single volume. It was heavier than it should have been. Miss Marple opened it. Inside, a hollow, and within it, nothing. She smiled. Of course, she said. Not gone. Moved. She replaced the book carefully. The hiding place, she murmured, but not the contents. A sound behind her. Miss Marple did not turn. You see, she said calmly, this is where they were kept. Silence. Then, yes. It was Mr. Adrian Cross. Miss Marple turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, his expression composed but no longer entirely relaxed. You're very thorough, he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. One tries. Mr. Cross stepped into the room. You believe the papers were hidden there, he said. I do, Miss Marple replied. And now they are gone. Yes, he studied her. And you think I took them? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think, she said, that you lost something you expected to control. His eyes flickered. Lost? He repeated. Yes, Miss Marple said. Because if you had them, Dr. Firth would not be dead. A pause. A longer one. Then Mr. Cross spoke. You are very certain of your conclusions. Miss Marple folded her hands. Not entirely, she said, but sufficiently. He moved closer. And what do you intend to do with them? My conclusions? Miss Marple said. Yes. She met his gaze. I intend, she said gently, to complete them. Another silence. Then Mr. Cross smiled. It was a different smile from before, less polished, more revealing. Be careful, Miss Marple, he said. Miss Marple's expression did not change. My dear Mr. Cross, she said, I always am. They stood facing one another, two minds, two understandings, and between them, a truth not yet spoken, but very nearly ready to be. Chapter 11. A second absence. The following morning did not begin with routine. It began with discovery. Celia was the one who found it, or rather, noticed what was not there. Miss Marple was in the breakfast room quietly stirring her tea when Celia entered with a face that had lost what little colour remained. Aunt Jane, she said, her voice unsteady. Something's wrong. Miss Marple looked up calmly. Yes, she said. That is becoming a habit. Celia moved closer. It's Mr. Dane, she said. He's gone. Miss Marple set down her spoon. Gone? She repeated. He isn't in his room, Celia said, and no one has seen him this morning. Miss Marple considered this. Did he leave a message? No. Any sign of departure? Celia shook her head. Nothing. Miss Marple rose slowly. Then, she said, we must not assume he has left. Celia stared at her. What else could it mean? Miss Marple's gaze was steady. It could mean, she said, that he did not intend to go far. The search began quietly. Mr. Adrian Cross was informed first. His reaction was measured. I am sure there is a reasonable explanation, he said. Mr. Dane is not a man inclined to announce his movements. Miss Marple watched him. Yes, she said. He prefers to observe rather than be observed. Mrs. Beatrice Cross was less composed. This is becoming intolerable, she said. First Dr. Firth, and now this. He may simply have gone into the village, Mr. Cross said. Without telling anyone? Celia asked. It would not be unprecedented, he replied. Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she walked. Through the corridors, into the study. Nothing. To the garden. Still nothing. And then she stopped. The path to the pond. Yes, she murmured. Of course. Inspector Hale had already stationed a constable nearby, but the grounds remained largely undisturbed. Miss Marple approached slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar space. The pond lay as before, still, dark, unyielding. But something had changed. She stepped closer and saw it. Not in the water, beside it. A disturbance in the earth, subtle but present. Miss Marple crouched slightly, examining it. Footprints, 2 sets, one deeper than the other. One man standing, she said softly, one resisting. A voice behind her. "You found something." "Inspector Hale." Miss Marple rose. "Yes," she said. "I believe I have." He stepped forward. "What is it?" Miss Marple gestured lightly. "Someone was here last night," she said, "and not alone." Inspector Hale studied the ground. "You think this is connected to Mr. Dane's disappearance?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. He looked toward the pond. "You think he's in there?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the water. Then, she said quietly, "Yes." The second search was faster, less hesitant. The constable waded in, and within minutes, the surface broke. Celia, who had insisted on coming, turned away with a cry. Inspector Hale's face hardened. Miss Marple remained still. Mr. Oliver Dane was brought from the water, still, silent, like Dr. Firth before him. Inspector Hale spoke first. "This is no coincidence," he said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It is not." He turned to her. "2 deaths," he said. "Same location." "Yes." "Same method?" he asked. Miss Marple considered. "I think," she said, "we shall find that the method is similar, but not identical." Inspector Hale frowned. "Or what do you mean?" Miss Marple's gaze remained on the pond. "I think," she said, "that the first death was necessary." "And the second?" he asked. Miss Marple turned to him. "The second," she said, "was inevitable." The house received the news in silence. Mr. Cross stood very still. Mrs. Cross sat down without speaking. Celia wept. Miss Marple watched them all. 2 deaths, 2 men, both connected, both silenced. Yes, she thought. Now it is clear. Inspector Hale addressed the room. "No one leaves the house," he said. "Not until we understand what has happened here." Mr. Cross inclined his head. "Of course," he said. Mrs. Cross said nothing. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. "Inspector," she said. He turned. "Yes?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that you are very close to the truth." Inspector Hale studied her. "Then perhaps you would care to share it?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not yet," she said. His expression tightened. "Why not?" Miss Marple glanced around the room, at each face, at each reaction. "At present," she said, "it is still only a pattern." Inspector Hale crossed his arms. "And when will it be more than that?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "When the final piece reveals itself," she said. Later, alone once more, Miss Marple stood by the window. The garden stretched out before her, the pond beyond, 2 lives taken, 1 truth hidden, but not for much longer. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said softly, "you are becoming desperate." And desperation was never careful, which meant the next move would not be perfect, and when it came, Miss Marple would be waiting. We're at Chapter 12, The Shape of Fear. The second death changed everything. Not outwardly. Wren House still maintained its routines, its meals were still served, its rooms still arranged with quiet precision. But beneath that surface, something had fractured beyond repair. Fear had taken form. Miss Marple observed it in the smallest ways, in the hesitation before a door was opened, in the silence that lingered too long after a question, in the glances, brief, guarded, and often avoided. Yes, she thought, it is no longer concealed. Fear, once shared, behaved differently. It no longer hid itself. It searched. Inspector Hale had increased his presence in the house. A constable now remained in the corridor at all hours. Statements were taken again, questions repeated. But repetition, Miss Marple knew, rarely produced truth, only refinement. She sat in the morning room while Inspector Hale spoke with Mrs. Beatrice Cross. The door was not fully closed. Miss Marple did not strain to listen. She simply allowed the words to reach her. "You were alone that evening?" Inspector Hale asked. "Yes," Mrs. Cross replied. "For the entire time?" "Yes." "No interruptions?" A pause. "No." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. A pause is never empty, she thought. It always contains something. Later, Inspector Hale joined Miss Marple. "I find them all controlled," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "Control is a most revealing quality. You believe one of them is lying." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied, "they are all lying." He looked at her sharply. "All of them?" "Yes," she said, "though not all about the same thing." Inspector Hale exhaled. "That is precisely the difficulty," Miss Marple nodded. "On the contrary," she said, "it is precisely the solution." He frowned. "I don't follow." Miss Marple folded her hands. "When several people conceal different truths," she said, "those truths begin to overlap." Inspector Hale's expression shifted. "And where they overlap, they reveal what matters," Miss Marple finished. He looked at her for a long moment. "You have something," he said. Miss Marple did not deny it. "I have an arrangement," she said. "Of what?" "Of behaviour," she replied. Inspector Hale leaned forward slightly. "And what does that arrangement suggest?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "That one person," she said, "has been guiding the others without their knowledge." Inspector Hale's eyes narrowed. Guiding them how?" "By allowing them to believe what's convenient," she said. He stood slowly. "And you know who that person is?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "I believe I do." That afternoon, Miss Marple asked Celia to join her in the garden. They walked once more toward the yew tree. "I am afraid," Celia said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "That is quite understandable." "Two people are dead," Celia said, "and we are still here, with whoever did it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." Celia stopped walking. "Then why do we stay?" she asked. Miss Marple turned to her. "Because," she said, "leaving would not make us safer." Celia stared at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's expression was calm. "I mean," she said, "that the danger is not the place." Celia's breath caught. "It's the person." "Yes," Miss Marple said. A silence followed. Then Celia spoke again, her voice quieter. "You know who it is." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the house. "At present," she said, "I know enough." "That's not the same," Celia said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It is better." Celia frowned. "Better?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Because certainty requires proof, and proof requires opportunity." Celia's hands trembled slightly. "And how do we get that?" Miss Marple turned back to her. "We wait," she said. Celia shook her head. "That's what you said before." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but now we wait differently." That evening Miss Marple made a small change. It was so small that no one remarked upon it. She moved her knitting basket from the chair by the window to the table near the door. An ordinary adjustment, easily overlooked. But Miss Marple knew it would matter. Night fell. The house settled into its uneasy quiet. Miss Marple sat in the sitting room, her knitting in her lap, waiting, not idly, but precisely. Time passed. Then, footsteps. Again. Measured. Deliberate. Miss Marple did not look up. The door opened. "Still awake, Miss Marple?" It was Mrs. Beatrice Cross. Miss Marple smiled. "I often am," she said. Mrs. Cross stepped inside. "You must find all of this very stimulating," she said. Miss Marple tilted her head. "I find it instructive," she replied. Mrs. Cross moved closer. "You observe a great deal," she said. "One tries," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Cross's gaze drifted to the knitting basket. "You've moved your things," she said. Miss Marple followed her gaze. "Oh," she said lightly. "Yes, I thought it more convenient." Mrs. Cross nodded slowly. "How practical." There was a pause. Then Mrs. Cross spoke again. "Tell me, Miss Marple," she said, "do you believe everything can be understood?" Miss Marple looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Even this?" Mrs. Cross asked. "Especially this," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Cross's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "And what have you understood?" she asked. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "That fear," she said, "does not behave the same in everyone." Mrs. Cross's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Some people hide it," she said. "Some people deny it. And some—" She paused. "Some act upon it." A silence followed. Mrs. Cross did not move. "And which am I?" she asked. Miss Marple met her gaze. "That," she said gently, "is what I am about to confirm." The air between them shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. Mrs. Cross smiled. A different smile, less controlled, more revealing. "Be careful, Miss Marple," she said softly. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "My dear Mrs. Cross," she replied, "I always am." They stood facing one another, and for the first time, the truth stood very near the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer be denied. Chapter 13. The Test of a Small Thing. Miss Marple did not sleep that night, not because she was uneasy. Unease had long since settled into something far more useful, but because she had reached that particular point in a puzzle where action, however slight, became necessary. The house was quiet, not naturally quiet, but held, as though every sound had been deliberately reduced. Miss Marple remained seated in the sitting room, her knitting resting neatly beside her on the table where she had placed it earlier. Yes, she thought, everything is ready. The test, as she had arranged it, was a simple one. It required no confrontation, no accusation, only a choice. And choices, Miss Marple knew, revealed far more than questions ever could. She rose shortly after midnight and moved slowly toward the study. The corridor was dim, the light barely sufficient to define the edges of the walls. Miss Marple walked with quiet certainty. She did not pause, she did not hesitate, because she knew someone else would. Inside the study she made a small adjustment, so small that no one unfamiliar with the room would notice it. She removed one book from the shelf, the same volume she had examined earlier, and placed it slightly out of alignment. Not enough to draw attention, or only enough to invite correction. Then she stepped back. "Yes," she murmured, "that will do." She left the room, the door slightly ajar. The waiting was not long. Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her knitting, not because she needed it, but because it completed the appearance. Time passed. Then, footsteps. Again, but different this time. Not cautious, not measured, decisive. Miss Marple did not look up. The footsteps moved past the sitting room, toward the study. A pause. Then, the faint sound of a door opening. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. She did not hurry. She rose and followed. The study door stood open. Inside, Mrs. Beatrice Cross. Her back was turned, but her posture told everything, still, focused, possessive. Miss Marple stepped inside. "I wondered," she said gently, "how long it would take." Mrs. Cross did not turn immediately. Her hand rested on the shelf, on the book. Slowly. She replaced it, perfectly aligned. Then she turned. Her expression was calm, too calm. "You arranged this," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes." Mrs. Cross's gaze sharpened. "To see whether I would notice. To see whether you would correct it," Miss Marple said. A pause. Then, Mrs. Cross smiled. A real smile this time, not polite, not controlled. "But of course I would," she said. "I prefer things as they should be." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "You do." Silence followed. Then Mrs. Cross spoke again. "You're very clever," she said. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "Only attentive." Mrs. Cross stepped away from the shelf. "And now?" she asked. "What happens now?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Now," she said. "Before we speak plainly," Mrs. Cross considered this. "Very well," she said. Miss Marple moved slightly closer. "The papers," she said, "were kept here." Mrs. Cross did not deny it. "Yes." "You knew where they were." "Yes." "You took them." A pause. Then, "Yes," Mrs. Cross said. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And Dr. Firth discovered that." Mrs. Cross's expression shifted, only slightly. "He was observant," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and that made him inconvenient." Mrs. Cross's voice remained steady. "He misunderstood what he saw." "No," Miss Marple said. "He understood it perfectly." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple continued. "You met him at the pond," she said. Mrs. Cross did not answer. "You spoke with him," Miss Marple went on. "You persuaded him to come there, perhaps under some pretence." Mrs. Cross's eyes held hers. "And then?" she asked. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And then," she said, "you killed him." The words did not echo. They did not need to. Mrs. Cross did not react immediately. "Then?" She exhaled. "Yes," she said. Celia's voice came suddenly from the doorway. "No." Both women turned. Celia stood there, pale, trembling. "You," she whispered. Mrs. Cross looked at her. "My dear," she said, almost gently, "you should not have come." Celia shook her head. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do that?" Mrs. Cross's expression changed again, not softer, not harder, clearer. "Because," she said, "he would have ruined everything." "What everything?" Celia demanded. Mrs. Cross's gaze flickered briefly toward Miss Marple. "She knows," she said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "I do." Mrs. Cross turned back to Celia. "The papers your aunt kept," she said, "contained information about financial arrangements, partnerships, identities." Celia frowned. "I don't understand." "No," Mrs. Cross said. "You were not meant to." Miss Marple spoke then. "They revealed," she said gently, "that Mr. Adrian Cross is not who he claims to be." Celia stared at her. "What?" Mrs. Cross smiled faintly. "At last," she said, "the important part." Miss Marple continued. "His connection to your aunt's estate was not legitimate," she said. "It was constructed." Celia turned toward the door. "Adrian?" He was already there, standing just beyond the threshold, silent, listening. Miss Marple looked at him calmly. "Yes," she said. "You see, Mrs. Cross was protecting something." Mrs. Cross's voice sharpened. "Protecting?" she said. "No." Miss Marple met her gaze. "Controlling," she corrected. A pause. Then Mrs. Cross laughed softly. "Yes," she said. "That is better." Celia's voice trembled. "And Mr. Dane?" she asked. Mrs. Cross's smile faded. "He knew too much," she said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes," she said. "He found the papers, or part of them, enough to understand." "And so you killed him too," Celia said. Mrs. Cross did not answer, but she did not need to. Inspector Hale's voice came from behind them. "I think," he said, "that will be quite sufficient." He stepped into the room. 2 constables followed. Mrs. Cross did not resist. She simply looked at Miss Marple. "You arranged this," she said. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You did." Mrs. Cross smiled once more. "Perhaps," she said. Then she allowed herself to be led away. Silence settled over the room. Celia stood still, her hands trembling. Mr. Cross did not move. Miss Marple looked at him. "Yes," she said quietly, "you too will have questions to answer." He met her gaze, but said nothing. Later, as the house began to empty of tension, slowly, imperfectly, Miss Marple returned to the sitting room. She picked up her knitting once more. The pattern, at last, complete. "Yes," she murmured softly. "It is always the smallest thing. The button, the book, the hesitation. Each one insignificant alone, but together inevitable." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, calm, precise, and entirely satisfied that, once again, human nature had revealed exactly what it was. Chapter 14. What Remains in Quiet Places. The departure of Mrs. Beatrice Cross did not bring immediate peace to Wren House. Such things never did. The removal of guilt, Miss Marple often reflected, did not erase its consequences. It merely allowed them to settle, slowly, unevenly, into the spaces left behind. The house felt larger, not emptier precisely, but altered, as though something tightly wound had finally been released, leaving the air uncertain of how to behave. Inspector Hale remained for the better part of the day. There were statements to finalise, arrangements to confirm, and, most significantly, Mr. Adrian Cross to consider. Miss Marple observed their conversation from a distance. Mr. Cross was composed as always, but composure, she knew, was not the same as innocence. "You understand," Inspector Hale was saying, "that your position here is now under scrutiny." Mr. Cross inclined his head. "Of course." "You did not correct your wife's actions," Hale continued. "No," Mr. Cross said. I did not." Inspector Hale watched him closely. "Why?" A pause. Then, "Because," Mr. Cross said, "I did not fully understand them." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "Ah," she thought, "not entirely untrue." Inspector Hale made a note. "You will remain available for further inquiry," he said. "Certainly." The conversation ended, but the questions did not. Celia found Miss Marple in the garden later that afternoon. The yew tree cast its familiar shadow, though the bench beneath it now seemed less inviting than before. "It's over," Celia said. Miss Marple looked up. "Yes," she said, "the danger has passed." Celia hesitated. "But it doesn't feel over," she said. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It rarely does." Celia sat beside her. "I keep thinking about what she said," she continued. "About control, about everything being arranged." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Mrs. Cross was a woman who believed she could manage outcomes," she said. "Such people often confuse influence with certainty." Celia looked down. "And she killed for it?" "Yes." There was a long silence. Then Celia spoke again. "And Adrian?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple considered her carefully. "Mr. Cross," she said, "is a man who benefits from ambiguity." Celia frowned. "I don't understand." "He allowed a false position to exist," Miss Marple said, "and he did not question it too closely." "Because it helped him," Celia said. "Yes." Celia's expression hardened slightly. "Then he's just as bad." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No," she said, "not just as bad." Celia looked at her. "But still not innocent." "No," Miss Marple said. The matter of the papers was resolved quietly. They were recovered, hidden, as Miss Marple had suspected, not far from their original place. Their contents confirmed everything: false identities, fabricated connections, carefully constructed authority. Miss Marple did not examine them in detail. She did not need to. The shape of the truth had already revealed itself. 2 days later, preparations were made for Miss Marple's departure. The house had begun in its way to settle. Celia moved more easily. The servants spoke again without hesitation. Even the garden seemed less watchful. Yet something remained, something that would not entirely leave. Miss Marple stood once more by the window in her room, looking out toward the far edge of the grounds. The pond was still visible, though only just. It lay quiet now, unremarkable, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. "Yes," she murmured, "that is often the way." Celia came to say goodbye. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Miss Marple smiled. "My dear," she said, "you must not think of it in that way." "But if you hadn't come," Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "If I had not come," she said, "something else would have happened." Celia looked at her. "Something worse?" Miss Marple's gaze was thoughtful. "Perhaps," she said. A pause. Then Celia asked, "Will you tell me one thing?" "If I can," Miss Marple replied. Celia hesitated. "When did you know?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I did not know," she said. "Not at first." "But when did you suspect her?" Miss Marple considered. "When she answered too carefully," she said. Celia frowned. "That doesn't seem like much." "It is everything," Miss Marple said gently. "People who are truthful rarely consider their answers so precisely." Celia was silent. "And the rest?" she asked. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The rest," she said, "was simply observation." The journey back to St. Mary Mead was uneventful. Miss Marple sat by the window watching the countryside pass with its familiar rhythm. Fields, hedgerows, small houses that kept their secrets in quieter ways. She held her knitting in her lap, though she did not work. Her thoughts lingered briefly on Wren House, on Celia, on the quiet arrangement of people and motives that had led, inevitably, to violence. "Yes," she said softly, "it is always the same in the end. Not the details, those were endlessly varied, but the nature of it, the small decisions, the careful concealments, the belief, so often misplaced, that one could control what others would never discover." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and smiled faintly, because she knew they always did. Back in St Mary Mead, life resumed as it always had. The vicar spoke at length. Mrs Price Ridley misunderstood everything, and the village, in its quiet way, continued. Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. Her knitting resumed its steady rhythm. Peaceful, orderly, deceptively simple. She glanced out at her garden. Yes, she said, human nature is much the same everywhere. Her needles clicked softly, and though the world continued, as it always did, Miss Marple remained exactly as she had always been, observing, understanding, and when necessary, acting, was Chapter 15. The Man Who Remained. The house did not feel empty after Mrs. Cross's arrest. It felt exposed. Miss Marple noticed it immediately the following morning, the way sound travelled differently, the way doors no longer closed with the same quiet restraint, the way conversations began too quickly, as though silence itself had become uncomfortable. Yes, she thought, when one secret is removed, the others grow restless. Celia sat opposite her at breakfast, her expression calmer than before, though not yet settled. "You'll be leaving soon," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "I believe I shall." Celia hesitated. "And then?" "Then," Miss Marple said, "life will continue, as it always does." Celia did not seem entirely reassured. "There's still something that doesn't feel finished," she said. Miss Marple buttered her toast with care. "No," she said, "there is not." Celia looked up. "But Adrian—" "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. Mr. Adrian Cross entered the room at that moment. He was, as always, composed, but something had shifted. Not visibly, but undeniably. He no longer carried the quiet authority he had worn so comfortably before. Now, he waited. "Miss Marple," he said, taking his seat, "I understand you will be leaving us shortly." "Yes," she said. "I believe my visit has achieved its purpose." A faint pause. "And what purpose was that?" he asked. Miss Marple met his gaze. "To observe," she said. He smiled slightly. "And have you observed everything?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Not everything," she said, "but enough." Celia watched them both, her tension returning. "Adrian," she said suddenly, "is it true?" He turned to her. "Is what true?" "That you weren't who you said you were," she said. A longer pause this time. Then Mr. Cross exhaled. "I suppose," he said, "that there is little point in denying it now." Celia stared at him. "So it's all false?" "Not all," he said, "but enough to matter." Miss Marple observed him carefully. A man who concedes selectively, she thought. Inspector Hale arrived shortly after. "I'll need a few more answers," he said plainly. Mr. Cross inclined his head. "Of course." They moved to the study. Miss Marple did not follow. She already knew what would be said. Instead, she remained in the sitting room, waiting, because there was still one final thread. An hour later, Inspector Hale returned. "He's not directly involved in the murders," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "No," she said. "He is not." "But he knew," Hale added. "Yes." Inspector Hale frowned. "Why didn't he act?" Miss Marple looked at him gently. "Because," she said, "it did not suit him." That afternoon, Miss Marple took one last walk to the pond. It lay as it always had, still, unchanged, as though it had not held death at all. "Yes," she murmured. "Places do not remember. People do." She turned, and there, standing a short distance away, was Mr. Adrian Cross. "I thought you might come here," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. It seemed appropriate. He looked at the water. "She went too far," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "She did." "And yet," he added, "it might have worked." Miss Marple looked at him sharply. "For a time," he said. She studied him. "You are a dangerous man," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "or only a practical one." Miss Marple shook her head. "That is what dangerous men often believe." A pause. Then, "You won't say anything more?" he asked. Miss Marple met his gaze. "My dear Mr. Cross," she said, "I have already said enough." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then he turned and walked away. Miss Marple watched him go. "Yes," she said softly, "not all crimes end with justice." She turned back toward the house. "But enough do.